Good morning from London and good afternoon to you, wherever you are. Welcome to this webinar on gender-sensitive post-legislative scrutiny. My name is Franklin De Vrieze, the Senior Governance Advisor at the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. Before we start, I'd like to mention a couple of housekeeping rules for this Zoom meeting. So during this webinar, and as the experts are delivering their presentations, only their video and microphones will be enabled, so you won't be able to ask questions verbally. However, at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A box where you can write your questions or comments, and we'll address them during the question session. We encourage you to write questions and comments as the webinar unfolds, and we advise to keep the questions short and also to indicate to whom the question is directed. I also want to let you know that we are recording this session so we can share it with the other colleagues who can't join today. Now, I would like to start our session in a bit an unusual way by showing a picture. So, what do we see here? What is the most striking about this picture? What is very specific about this road? We see a road with no signs. There are no road signs. And we see a road where nobody is around to ask the way. There is nobody to give directions. So imagine you are traveling on such a road that has no signs and there is no one to ask. You may be on the right track, or you may be lost, going into the direction opposite to your destination. Now, this road represents the lawmaking process. Parliamentarians and policymakers are traveling on this road as they prepare for new legislation. And imagine you are on this road as well, preparing for new legislation. And as you do, you need signs that you're on the right track. Or you need to be able to ask other people. And those other people are the experts, fellow MPs, parliamentary staff, researchers. And the road signs you need is any information on how legislation has worked so far. What has been the outcome of legislation? What has been its impact? What were challenges or unintended consequences? What are the data emerging from analyzing the implementation of legislation? How can legislation be amended and improved? What can we learn from post-legislative scrutiny? And during the past couple of years, WFD has worked to generate these road signs and to strengthen post-legislative scrutiny. We have worked on country analysis, comparative analysis, developing principles of PLS emerging from this practice, a manual, and a couple of innovative pilot projects on PLS, which were the basis to amend and improve the legislation. We have worked with motivated parliamentarians and experts, including from academic institutions such as University of Hull and its Journal of Legislative Studies by Lord Norton, and the Institute for Advanced Legal Studies of the University of London, where we work with Maria Mousmouti joining us today. And we learned that PLS has grown into an emerging dimension within the oversight role of Parliament, holding the government to account on the way how they implement the law as intended. And we also identified that the role of Parliament itself is not only to adopt legislation, but to keep an eye on and assess its impact. Now today, we go one step further in the PLS work, and we start the development of a thematic focus on PLS, having a thematic angle to PLS. And we will be looking at PLS of environmental legislation, PLS of election legislation, but today we start on gender-sensitive PLS. And I'm very pleased that we can do that in an informed way, on a solid basis of prior research. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I'm pleased to hand over to my colleague, Shannon O'Connell, who is the Senior Advisor on Gender and Politics at WFD and has just become this week our new Director of Programs at WFD. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, Franklin, very much. And thanks everyone for joining us on this discussion. I think as Franklin outlined very well, this is a unique area, but a very important one. The origin of working in this area for WFD has to do with some of those very motivated parliamentarians and legislative specialists that Franklin described. like a number of organizations that work on the stability and the ability of political institutions to deliver, we've worked with some very skilled politicians and policy analysts. And one of the areas we've done a lot of work on is on equality legislation. And most specifically, in terms of WFD's origin story, legislation around preventing, prosecuting, protecting when it comes to issues of domestic violence and gender-based violence. A lot of hard work was done in a number of countries to get this legislation passed. And when the legislation was passed, there was a sense of, phew, we've gotten somewhere, we've made a difference. But what we hadn't realized at the time, and we've come to learn with all of our partners, is passing legislation and implementing it are not the same thing. And this is particularly troublesome when it does come to important legislation like domestic violence legislation, and also some of the very critical commitments that are now being made as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. As somebody who works very much on the intersection of equality, inclusion, and the quality of democracy and governance that we all experience, to me, every piece of legislation has a gender dimension, so that every piece of legislation should be looked at through this framework. And I'm grateful to our colleagues, to Franklin for his leadership on this issue, and also to Maria, Dr. Mousmouti, and also Dr. Tom Cagle, who have been very good partners to WFD. I'll be introducing our panel shortly, but also to recognize the pioneering work that has also been done by Dr. Sonia Palmieri and Sheila Quinn on issues of gender equality globally. So as I say, I'm very glad you're here to join us for this conversation. It is a critical one, and we do have an excellent panel to help guide us through this, the beginning of a very, very important and nuanced conversation. So the author of the papers that we're here to discuss today, and we are really grateful for her willingness and her leadership and her bravery for taking this on as a newer area, is Dr. Maria Mousmouti. She's a lecturer in law at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies at the University of London. She's also executive director at the Center for European Constitutional Law, which is a research center based in Athens, which is a nice place to spend your July. Her research interests evolve in the niche field of legislative studies, with a specific focus on legislative quality and effectiveness. Again, we're very grateful that she was willing to bring her skills and her intellectual rigor to this project. Dr. Sonia Palmieri is someone whose work I've admired for a very long time. She is currently Gender Policy Fellow at Australia National University, but over the past 15 years, Sonia has worked across many fields: academic, development, parliamentary institutions, principally with the interest of understanding and improving women's political leadership and participation. She has driven the international research agenda on gender-sensitive parliaments, and most recently was one of the co-authors with Dr. Sarah Childs of UN Women's Primer for Parliaments on a gender-sensitive response to COVID, which is an absolutely critical piece of analysis that needs to happen, both for what's happening now in terms of the lockdown, shutdown policies, but also the recovery. Sheila Quinn is an activist, an educator, a writer, and a researcher. We're sharing the same island here. I'm in the north of Ireland, and she's in the Republic of Ireland. She works primarily on gender equality and women's empowerment, with a particular focus on gender mainstreaming, gender impact assessment, and gender budgeting. I've always loved working with Sheila because she asks the difficult questions that need to be asked. And sometimes these makes people in power uncomfortable, and sometimes that's where they need to be. So we're glad to have Sheila as part of this conversation as well. Also, Dr. Tom Cagle is a lecturer in politics at Newcastle University. He teaches on a range of modules covering comparative politics, British politics, parliamentary politics. But his PhD was actually in post-legislative scrutiny, so a very unique area. He's been a valuable partner to WFD as we've looked further into this area as well. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming this panel. We're grateful for their time and their contributions. At this point, I will hand over to Maria to tell us more about the papers and her findings. Your the perennial, your mic is off.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Franklin. Thank you to all the panelists. I'm very, very happy to be here, but I will save the thank yous for later because I only have few precious moments to go through my the main concepts and ideas that are behind the policy paper and the case study that we are discussing today. So I would like to jump directly to that. So some slides should come on shortly. So the obvious point, or the main point to start this discussion, if we could have the next slide, please, is the fact that whether we realize it or not, every law has a gender. And there are different layers or different fields in which different elements of legislation that you can scrutinize in order to see the gender of the law. Well, the most obvious one would be language. And we know that in many jurisdictions around the world, gender neutral language or gender inclusive language is not a reality. So that would be one thing. Then a second and much more trickier area in which to detect the gender of a law is its content. So the way it regulates behaviors, the kind of rules it sets, the kind of standards it requires, and the extent to which these are more or less relevant to different genders. And then again, the results. And we've had many examples from jurisdictions around the world where a law is considered to be a good law and then it's implemented and you see a lot of disparate impact on men, women, and other population groups. And often this comes as a surprise. So the question here is, and the question that I've been struggling with while working on these papers, and if we could have the next slide, is how can we actually achieve gender sensitive legislation? We talk about gender sensitive parliaments and they produce laws. How can these laws be made gender sensitive? By gender sensitive, I mean laws that take into account and integrate the concerns of different genders into legislative decision making. Not in order to favor one gender or the other, but in order to ensure that there are no unwanted impacts, or that the impacts are controlled, that they are the ones that we are actually trying to achieve. So if we think about that, and especially in relation to general legislation, meaning not legislation that has a gender-specific focus like gender-based violence, it's the only way for legislation to actively contribute and promote gender equality. So I mean, gender equality as a policy goal, as a horizontal policy goal, requires both specific legislation on gender-specific issues, but also gender-sensitive legislation in all other issues that will bring everything a step forward. So if we could have the next slide, how can we achieve gender sensitive legislation? Well, I guess the answer is rather obvious to most of those attending this session. It's through a systematic process of mainstreaming gender across the life cycle of legislation. And my emphasis here is on systematic and on across the life cycle of legislation. And I will try to explain why in the next slide. So Franklin started, if we could have the next slide, thank you. Franklin started this session by showing us the legislative process visualized as a road, an endless road. Actually, this road is not a straight line, but a circle. It's a circle where each phase feeds into the other. If we could have the, so legislation and the design of legislation is the first obvious stage of the starting point of this circle, but then legislation is implemented, and any errors that have taken place in the design of legislation will become evident during implementation. And then these can be picked up during a post-legislative scrutiny stage. So one phase feeds into the other. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, and if we could move on to the next slide, is that gender is not a one-off concern. Gender is something that needs to be considered throughout these phases. Then trying to look at gender at post-legislative scrutiny in particular. I mean, the advantage of post-legislative scrutiny is hindsight. It's a very good moment in time to look at the broader picture and try to understand how the law worked, what it achieved, what it did not achieve, what worked well, what didn't work well, and what needs to be changed. So we all know that this is emerging practice, and although it sounds obvious, it's something that is not happening. And it's really during the last decade, I could say, that it is becoming the need for it, and the intensivity of conducting PLS is becoming more and more evident. So what gender sensitivity adds to post-legislative scrutiny, and Kirti, please, if you could add exactly, it adds a complementary layer of analysis. So it doesn't just look at legislation and how it worked, but it also looks at legislation from a gender perspective. So it looks at how it worked with regard to men and women, whether it affected them in different ways, what kind of achievement can we count on, what kind of impacts can be observed from a gender perspectives, and how you can maximize the good points, or how can you can correct the unfortunate points. So gender sensitive post-legislative scrutiny is a structured process. It's not a random exercise, it's a structured process, and WFD and Franklin, through their work, have done an excellent job in systematizing the different steps that one needs to take if they want to conduct a scrutiny exercise that is comprehensive and that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the way in which to add this gender layer into the analysis that any scrutiny is conducting is, again, by mainstreaming gender concerns in this process, especially when it comes to the objectives, the stakeholders, the data collection, the consultations, and the analysis of findings and reporting. And there are four particular points that I would like to bring into the discussion, which are in the next slide. And the first one is to put gender in the scrutiny radar. What I have seen from all the PLS reports that I examined is that it is rarely there. So gender tends to be an invisible issue, especially when we're talking about general legislation, so not gender-specific legislation. So the first, I think you need to ask the question in order to be able to have answers to the question. So you need to raise the issue, you need to put the issue on the table, you need to put gender concerns in the scrutiny radar. And how can you do that? You can do it by including it in the terms of reference of any scrutiny being conducted. So a second point goes a little bit further and has to do with asking the right questions. So a scrutiny is not about everything. It's about looking at specific aspects of a law. So again, you need to ask the questions that make sense and that are relevant from a gender perspective. So you need to conduct some form of gender analysis and formulate this questions which make sense in the context of this scrutiny. And then again, if you ask the questions, of course, you need the data that will enable you to answer the questions. So we're looking into data collection. And data collection, again, needs to be gender sensitive in order to enable a gender lens to come into the scrutiny. And a final point, which I found was completely missing in what I scrutinized for the purposes of these papers, was to integrate a gender lens in findings and recommendations. Even reports that had somehow considered gender issues, or where these were brought forward by evidence or by experts or whatever, there was no reference to them in findings and recommendations. And again, I think this is important because it shows that the issue is in the agenda, and it puts the issue in the agenda, and it makes it visible rather than invisible. So looking in the next slide, trying to look a little bit more closely on what is being scrutinized. I mean, a scrutiny can focus on different questions. It's not about everything, but it's about effectiveness, how the law works. It's about efficiency, that has to do with costs, about implementation, about compliance and enforcement, about impact. And these are only some of the criteria that can be used to scrutinize legislation. But in the next slide, I've tried to give an example of how a gender-blind scrutiny questions can be turned into gender-sensitive. For example, take a look at this first question, which is about effectiveness. Is the act achieving its aims? And if not, why not? Well, it's a question that asks about a law and what it has actually done. So it's really not rocket science to add a gendered perspective to that and ask additional questions about how the law is impacting different genders, and at the end of the day, did it positively contribute to gender equality or not? So take a look at the next two questions, which are about costs and therefore about efficiency. These are expressed in a gender blind way, so in a way that is neutral, and adding a layer of a gender informed layer to that, and looking at how these costings affect men and women, or how are they distributed in women and men, between women and men, is, if you could add this, please, Kirti, yes. Or whether one gender has been disproportionately affected can only enrich the analysis and the discussion. And this last question, which is about implementation, an obvious one in almost every scrutiny, again, a lot can be asked with regard to how implementation affected women and men and non-binary people, and how these impacts can be corrected or improved. So this brings us to the question of data, because if we ask the questions, then we need to have the data to respond to these questions. And there are different types of data that can be used in scrutiny. And what I've found is that committees tend to rely quite a lot on small-scale qualitative data that they collect for the purposes of the scrutiny, through evidence, calls for evidence, through hearings, through oral sessions. So there again, it's very important to have gender in the questions and in the agenda. And in the next slide, I tried to come up with some key ideas about how to make sure that gender issues and a gender lens is present in the data collection instruments. So first obvious one is that gender questions need to be evident in the terms of reference for the scrutiny. Then they need to be integrated in the data collection instruments. Also, experts that are invited to contribute their findings, their expertise, their ideas and information need to be explicitly asked to report on gender-related experiences or information. Gender balance in the people who are invited to give evidence, that's not so obvious, and I can say that it is a practice in some parliaments, and I find this really interesting, given that men and women will contribute different versions of reality. And then again, giving a floor and making sure that gender experts can bring their informed insights into the inquiry. So, trying to conclude and to wrap this up, I find, the main actor in this whole process are committees, parliamentary committees. And what I said before, trying to bring gender in the agenda might seem obvious for a committee that has gender or equality issues in their mandate, but it might not be so obvious for committees with a broader or more general or thematic mandate. So I think that it is important to make sure that there is awareness of gender issues also in sectoral committees with different mandates, that they have the capacity to introduce gender relevant questions in their scrutiny and introduce this perspective in the scrutiny, that they have the potential and the capacity to communicate the findings of PLS, gender-sensitive findings, both within and outside the parliaments, and finally to learn from scrutiny, because scrutiny is a learning process, and it is a learning process and a way to improve legislation, not just the law that is actually being scrutinized, but also the laws that will come in the future. So we shouldn't overlook this important function, because we tend to repeat mistakes that have been made 1 million times and they never seem to stop. I think scrutiny is one way of realizing that this doesn't work and making sure that it's not repeated in the future. And trying to wrap up and conclude. So in the next slide, PLS has a dynamic which is both informative and transformative. Gender-sensitive post-legislative scrutiny is far from being standard practice, especially when general, meaning non-gender specific legislation is involved. It is extremely important because it makes gender issues visible and puts them in the agenda. I am repeating, especially when general legislation is concerned. There are quite a few challenges in place, and starting with the lack of awareness, but also having to do with culture and mindset and the lack of data, which is not always there. But at the same time, there are also some promising practices and developments that we can use as a springboard, I think. And as PLS practice becomes more and more widespread and embedded and sophisticated, I think it's a good moment to have this discussion and try to see how a gender lens can be integrated in post-legislative scrutiny so that it is made gender sensitive. So that's all from me. Thank you very much. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing back from all of you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Could we hand over to Sonia, please?
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank WFD for feeding our interest and possibly even our passion for gender-sensitive post-legislative scrutiny. And I really want to recognise and pay tribute to the growing community of practice which I see around me on gender-sensitive and diversity-sensitive parliaments. We are people who work in the trenches of parliaments around the world, who support parliamentary development, who are also academics. And sometimes we might feel that our work is unheeded or marginalised, and I think that's why it's really important to remember that we are not alone. And secondly, I want to thank Maria. Maria, you have created something outstanding in this case study and in the policy paper, and you've produced a really important and interesting guide that makes a compelling case. And I think we always need to have that compelling case for gender-sensitive scrutiny. And your added bonus, which I have to say is a missing element in much of mine, is that you include non-binary people. I think that's really important. So thank you and well done. Kirti, can I have some slides, please? We'll go to the next one. I want to make 3 points today. Kirti, could we please go to the next one? Thank you. And the first point I want to make is about what I'm going to call the politics of will. Let me take as a starting point Maria's quote, or a quote from Maria's paper. Gender-sensitive legislation is not the result of good intentions and political will alone. It is the result of a systematic process of integrating gender concerns in legislative decision-making that is called gender mainstreaming. Now, the very cute chick here is not meant as a distraction, but as a thought provocation. What comes first? The political will, the gender mainstreaming? Is it unidirectional? Well, I think that there has been an assumption in our thinking about gender mainstreaming that yes, it takes a certain amount of political will to institute the gender mainstreaming practices in Parliament. But once that political capital is spent, the systems of Parliament take over and gender-sensitive practices become taken for granted. But I think more recent research is kind of pointing to the fact that gender mainstreaming, even when it is mandated by laws and written into the standing orders, requires constant reinforcement. It requires a culture that values and legitimizes gender equality as a goal of parliamentary work, as Maria says. But I don't think that that direction is unidirectional. I think it keeps going in that cycle. It's cyclical. So what we find from gender mainstreaming efforts in our scrutiny, yes, should be used to improve the laws, it should be used to improve programmatic interventions, but it also needs to be used to develop a larger political constituency in the Parliament that supports gender equality. by that, we create a stronger culture in the Parliament for this work. And this is, of course, where the politics comes in, because thinking and working politically is now a very well-known narrative in development discourses. But we are not using it, I don't think, as effectively as we could be in our gender-sensitive parliamentary development. We absolutely need to know what the context is, what the political context is. We need to find our champions. We need to kind of build the coalitions and work with them to cultivate that culture for gender equality. And this is a long-term project, but it requires small, concrete, sustained investments over time. And let me say, I think all parliaments are in a phase of development when it comes to gender equality. The second point I want to make on the next slide relates to the politics of data. So again, Maria rightly notes, the parliaments need to think early on about data, introduce relevant requirements, monitoring indicators and data collection instruments to ensure that it will be made available during the implementation of the law. So I have a few interrelated points to make here. I think a critical concern across a range of policy areas is that decisions are often made on a fairly limited set of concrete, usually quantitative indicators that do get regularly collected. So in my area, which is women's leadership, we have relied on the number of seats held by women in national parliaments as a key measurement of women's access to decision making, because that data is collected regularly by the Interparliamentary Union, and it is not only collected, it's shown every month. So all of us can go there, but it is not an indicator of women's power in parliaments or of women's leadership outside of parliaments. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting we shouldn't have that indicator. I'm just suggesting that it is a kind of a proxy for it's used as a proxy for many other things, and that's unfortunate. So while there have been many exercises at the international level, and the SDG Data 2X process is absolutely one of them, to try and identify more comprehensive indicators, this is ultimately a question of money and time. And so we actually need more resources for this. A secondary point about data is that we often assume that the quantitative data that is collected by national statistical offices is reliable and valid. And it's not always so. So not only do we need to kind of improve Parliament's access to data, I think we also have to improve Parliament's capacity to test that reliability and validity, and to ask better questions about the kinds of data that they are using and receiving. And it could be things about, like, who produced the data? Was there any unconscious bias in the process of producing that data? What groups were included in the compilation of the data and what groups were not, and why? And how regularly was that data collected? Like, when was the last time it was collected? So rather than just accepting particularly gender disaggregated data as a kind of a truth, we should be improving capacity to test that. We also need to be, I think, as a community, much better at analysing that quantitative data. Because while we, I think, understand the difference between sex and gender, we're often using quantitative data from a sex perspective rather than a gender perspective. We aren't trying to find out where the power imbalances are and what the structural inequalities are that create that situation. So my final point that I wanted to kind of raise is around the politics of scrutiny. Again, Maria very rightly says, empowering parliamentary bodies to mainstream gender when laws and budgets are adopted and scrutinised ex post are necessary to make gender equality a reality. I'm going to make the case that post-legislative scrutiny is arguably the most democratic stage of the legislative cycle. and that's why we're here, because we love Parliament. It can be the point in the cycle that showcases the Parliament as a truly representative and accountable institution. But this is a qualified can, because it depends ultimately on the way in which the Parliament structures opportunities for the opposition to do its job. So we know from multiple reports, including the 2017 IPU UNDP Global Parliamentary Report on Oversight, that opportunities for oversight should be available to all MPs equally, but in practice, that's not often the case. Ideally, our opposition should have access to the kinds of information required to undertake gender-sensitive scrutiny. Ideally, oppositions would chair parliamentary bodies that drive this scrutiny, so that they can set a broader agenda, so that they can hear from a broader range of interests than those already considered by the government. Ideally, we would have oppositions writing and circulating widely, publicly, dissenting reports that outline the gender discrepancies in the legislation and its implementation. And ideally, oppositions could take those discrepancies and write new legislation or write motions or use the plenary to call those gaps out. I think this pandemic that we're all facing has uncovered, in some parts of the world at least, a tendency to equate crisis management with decisive rather than deliberative decision-making. But gender-sensitive decision-making and accountability takes time. So to go back to where I started, if we don't have a political culture that values gender equality as a goal, then it is the first casualty in a time of crisis. And this is where I want to just very shamelessly publicise something that I did recently that Shannon referred to, and that is the primer for parliaments in terms of making gender-sensitive responses in this pandemic. And I'm so thrilled that I was able to write it with the incomparable Professor Sarah Childs. But it was very much an attempt to help parliaments with something practical, to create a checklist by which parliaments in pressured times and pressured kind of environments have at their hands, at their disposal, the kinds of questions that they can ask to ensure a gender-sensitive and outcome for gender equality. I do think that it's good to have these tools, but we as the community that I referred to earlier also have a really strong responsibility to support parliaments in this process. They actually need us to kind of push the agenda to ensure that gender equality is something that's valued and legitimised by the parliament. I'll leave it there. I'm sure I could talk for a long time, but thank you.
Excellent points. Thank you, Sonia, very much. I'm sure we could all talk for a very long time about all of those. Thank you. Sheila, may I hand over to you, please? Just need to unmute your mic. The phrase of the COVID webinar.
Thank you, Shannon, and thank you to WFD for inviting me to be part of this discussion this morning, which I'm enjoying very much so far. And thank you especially to Maria for writing the papers. So we'll just go to the slides and I'll move right on to the second slide. I come to this discussion from a twofold starting place. So we'll just go to the second slide, thank you. Yeah, so the twofold, to say that all legislation should be gender sensitive, all scrutiny of legislation should be gender sensitive. And then my second position is, do we need another tool? So I come to it with some skepticism, which I think Shannon alluded to in her introduction earlier. And just going on to the next slide. All legislation should be gender sensitive. Indeed, all policies, all strategies, all functions of government and the administration of government should be gender sensitive. This is the mandate of gender mainstreaming, which Sonia has spoken to quite considerably. And going on to the next slide. And so here we just have a definition of gender mainstreaming, which I won't recite, but it does speak to the comprehensiveness of gender mainstreaming as a strategy. And just a reminder that it is the strategy which governments almost universally have accepted, and it is the one that still is the bedrock of the agenda for gender equality and women's empowerment. And going on to the next slide. So do we need another tool in what I believe is an already crammed toolbox? And I come to this particularly at this time because I'm an amateur DIYer. I like to make things. I like to think that I can make things. And in this COVID period, I have accumulated, and my partner will testify to this, a number of saws. So I have a jigsaw, a table saw, a circular saw, a number of hand saws, and I still am striving to make the perfect cut that will make my bookshelf not wobbly or crooked, but straight. And in the accumulation of tools, I realize I'm not a carpenter. If I were a carpenter, one tool would do me. I would know how to apply this tool. So I know the attraction to the accumulation of tools. And in particular, I know this when it comes to gender responsive budgeting, because when gender responsive budgeting began to become popular, everybody wanted it. Everybody thought that it was, I suppose they almost thought it was like an algorithm. We apply this and hey presto. And I am of the opinion, and this might seem blasphemous to some of my colleagues, but that some governments began to deal with gender responsive budgeting too early, at a point when there were other dimensions of the gender equality infrastructure that were not in place. And so I'm concerned that this might become another checklist, a tool of that nature. And I note that Maria, and I agree with her, that said that it's not rocket science to apply a gender perspective. However, it is science. And I believe that the undervaluing of the science, i.e. the knowledge that is within gender equality, the data that we have to collect, the understanding that we have to apply, which is all part of the analysis, that is science. And that science is undervalued when it comes to other dimensions of knowledge. So that when we come to putting together, in this case, post-legislative scrutiny and gender equality, there is a value on the other dimensions. I am concerned, rather I should say, that there's a value on the other dimensions of scrutiny and not so much on the gender dimension, which can lead to an inadequate scrutiny, if you like. I'm also concerned about the amount of legislation that parliaments produce, and that relative to that, there's a minuscule proportion of it that is subject to scrutiny. And so one has to then, I believe, balance the effort that one puts into making sure that it is that it is gender sensitive relative to the other dimensions and the other tools in our box that we use. And I suppose that this question of do we need another tool and is best answered locally in specific situations where the nature of gender inequality is best understood and where the agenda for the achievement of gender equality is best understood. So moving along, oh yeah, we're not all gardeners. And this is a bit like we're not all carpenters, but just to say that I used to have a very big garden, and my sister-in-law is a gardener by profession, and she used to come along and do a lot of work. And sometimes I'd be working with her and I'd look at what she had done compared to what I had done in terms of weeding, let's say. And so I said this, oh, look at me. And she said, I'm a gardener. It's what I do. And I realized I'm not a gardener. So we all may think that we can weed and plant and water and so, but we're not gardeners. So, and I think that I want to say that the gender expertise is vital. I suppose it's back to this idea of science, the science of gender equality. We need gender expertise. And by that, it's not just someone who is assigned the gender stuff. You deal with gender, you deal with equality, but it's either an external expertise that is engaged, or someone who is extensively and ongoingly trained to have that gender expertise. And that gender analysis is at the core of any work, and it cannot be applied by anyone. So parliamentary committees, and I agree that those are the best vehicles for the scrutiny of legislation, but they need gender expertise, and it is a science. I cannot emphasize that enough. So I also want to consider that in some cases, if we go on to the next slide, so if we break down the term post-legislative scrutiny, well, sometimes there just needs to be legislation. That in many countries, the only equality mandate comes from the Constitution. Now, obviously, you know, we can talk east, west, north, south, but in many places, where we all work in terms of development, the only mandate comes from the Constitution, and that is not enough. We need to make sure that that legislation is there, introduced to protect women from discrimination, to promote the equality of women. And we know that in the UK and in Ireland and in Canada and a couple of other places, we have, I suppose, the gold standard in legislation, the positive duty legislation, which not only requires public bodies to prevent and mitigate discrimination, but to actually promote equality. So we need to be working towards that kind of legislation. Legislation to increase the participation of women in decision-making, legislation to, and so on. There's a range of the types of legislation that need to be in place, I believe, before we can consider scrutiny as a... Now, I'm conscious also that all legislation should have a gender dimension. And then the scrutinizers. I believe that gender mainstreaming provides us with scrutinizers that have not in most cases been adequately resourced to do the job. We talk about the gender machinery, the gender equality machinery within governments, where we have interdepartmental committees, where we have assigned responsibilities. And these, I believe, are the scrutinizers, and I believe that it would be a good idea to return to the focus on that and to ensure that they exist and that they are resourced to do that job. And continuing, so in terms of so we think of post-legislative scrutiny, and so I'm conscious that we're very used now to evidence-based, results-based legislation policies. And so that if we take the view from the outset, that if we future-proof, if you like, that if we apply the data at that early stage of the formation of the legislation, or of the gender impact stage, where we can actually build into the legislation for the outcomes that we want to achieve, that if we keep our eyes on the prize, and I suppose with regard to keeping the eyes on the prize, that involves, and back to the science, knowing what gender equality looks like. And in order to do that, we need to know what gender inequality looks like. And I'm afraid that in many parts of the world, including in the most developed parts of the world, we're not sure of what gender inequality looks like. And therefore, how can we plan for the results that we need? And moving on. And then the other dimension of legislation is making legislation accessible to those for whom it is intended to help. And we know that this is a big thing. You know, if we look at our anti-discrimination legislation, that in order to access that, people need to be able to come forward. And that's, you know, hugely complex, troublesome kind of area where potential claimants are subject to victimization, where there are burdens on them that are not equal to the task, and so on. So these are difficult. And then we have cultural, historical laws that prevent women from having any legal standing. And this, I believe, is an important aspect that we need to look on. That there are barriers within existing laws that need to be removed. And of course, a lot of the work across the developing world is to investigate these laws and to remove those barriers. and that women need to be empowered to be able to access the legal system. And then finally, now the last time I looked, and this is over a year ago, the point that I want to make here is to make improvement of law an objective of PLS, of the Post-Legislative Scrutiny Act. And when I last looked, improving the legislation was not a stated objective of PLS. That there are, when legislation is being formed, as we know, and I look to as a most recent example to Ireland, where the abortion legislation was created a couple of years ago. And when that was being drafted, there were many interests who were making claims on the legislation. And so the government had to be strategic in how it drafted it. And in order to satisfy some interests, they had to build into the legislation a review structure. And I believe that, and I'm sure that you would agree with me, that building in the review structure into the legislation is probably one of the optimum ways of ensuring that you actually get the post-legislative scrutiny that is required. Sometimes that kind of paying attention to interest results in less robust legislation that you would like. So there were some aspects of the abortion legislation that were not quite as robust as we might have wanted. So the review process was designed specifically to ensure that those aspects would be revisited. And the same actually applies to the gender identity legislation, which goes back a few more years in Ireland, where they were paying attention to various interest groups, and they built in a review process in order to revisit these particular situations. And then just finally to say that international law, as we know, is constantly being reviewed to make its improvement. We can think, for example, of the Security Resolution 1325, which is 25 years old, I believe, and in that period since, there have been various other similar resolutions in order to strengthen the mandate of that. So thank you again for being part of this discussion, and I look forward to seeing it evolve over time.
Thank you, Sheila, very much. The fantastic contributions. It's very clear that we have opened a can of worms that is much bigger than we had anticipated, and we're going to run right up into our time at 11 o'clock without time for questions. Our apologies to those who are joining us. If you would like to put a question in the Q&A box, though, we will endeavor to follow up by email or other methods to respond to those. But without further delay, I will hand over to Tom.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for asking me to be part of the panel as well. I'll just kind of say that I come from this very much from a kind of expertise in post-legislative scrutiny, but also within post-legislative scrutiny in the UK as well. That being said, I think the experience of the UK actually has some lessons for us all in terms of how we could begin to make sure we embed gender-sensitive scrutiny, not just in post-legislative scrutiny, but across all parts of legislative scrutiny. As well. And kind of the first thing I wanted to touch upon was just with Maria's focus on case studies and partly focusing on the UK as well. My PhD was on post-leg in the UK, and I had the joy of going through over 500 post-leg recommendations from committees, and I went back over my data and having been asked to be on the panel. And my instincts from what I remember from going through that data was that there's very little, if any at all, of recommendations in particular which are focused upon the gendered aspects and gendered impacts of legislation which is being reviewed by parliamentary committees. I think a lot of that has to do, which I think Maria touched upon in her presentation, but also in the reports, is when it comes down to the guidance that they're being given. And I think a lot of the UK's guidance stems from 2006, where the Law Commission of England and Wales did a big report on post-leg and how it should move forward. And a lot of that guidance is very much gender blind. Which obviously then impacts upon the questions which committees then go on to ultimately ask. And I think the recent guidance I've seen from the UK Parliament, again, I could be wrong with this because I only have it in hard copy and it's unfortunately locked in my office and haven't had a chance to go in and check it. But my understanding is, again, that guidance remains gender blind. But again, Maria, one of the good things obviously from Maria's reports that she easily show how we can alter that guidance and make it focused around gender sensitive issues and begin asking the right questions about the impacts of legislation and whether the objectives have been ultimately met as well. And kind of second point I want to focus on is again very much what Maria said about post-stage being very much about hindsight. I always view post-stage as being kind of a safety net, kind of quality assurance on the basis that you can't obviously scrutinise everything. There's obviously time and resource limitations there, but it's a chance to catch issues which haven't been brought up during the legislative process. And I think it's safe to say, particularly from a UK perspective, that the gendered focus of scrutiny isn't necessarily there during the legislative process. But post-stage would it be an important access point at which we can begin to focus attention on the gendered impacts of law, which can then go on to feed back into the policy development process, but also the kind of wider legislative cycle as well. Because post-stage isn't the end of the policy cycle, it's essentially the end of one cycle but the start of another, in which it then begins to feed into new legislation. And I think if we can get committees to start thinking about scrutiny from a gender perspective in relation to post-leg, that then feeds back into the wider policy process within government as well. And even if we can't scrutinise everything, the fact that committees begin to focus upon kind of the gendered issues around the impact legislation will then pick up other government departments to think, oh, actually, if committees are starting to focus upon this, well, maybe we should start focusing upon this much more in terms of how we're drafting legislation, how we're developing policy ultimately as well, because at the end of the day, we could end up being skewed by a committee for not having thought about this in the long term. And so I think post-leg is an important access point, which you can begin to get parliaments in particular, but also government as well, thinking much more in depth about the gendered impact of the policy and legislation that they're ultimately introducing as well. Third point I just wanted to raise, I think it kind of built upon what Sonia was saying about data. And what struck me in Maria's report was kind of the phraseology of the power of data. I think it's often underappreciated just how important access to data is, how important access to information is for any kind of scrutiny. Because it ultimately impacts upon the questions that you ultimately go on to ask as well. I think the challenge that parliaments face in particular with this is that they're often at an information disadvantage in comparison to government. So while, yes, it's important that committees undertake evidence, take evidence and make sure that evidence is balanced in terms of gender, but has the gender expertise there as well. I think we also need to remember that often these organisations which are providing evidence have their own resource limitations as well. And actually, it's government that has the most information or has the ability to source as much information as possible on these issues, and quite often perhaps it isn't or isn't willing to share that information. I think trying to identify ways in which we can begin to bridge that gap in access to data is fundamentally important in terms of getting committees to ask the right questions in terms of gender scrutiny as well. So it's not just in terms of the guidance they have, but also the access to information that they have as well. Unfortunately, I don't think there's an easy answer to that other than parliaments beefing up their research bodies, which obviously in present circumstances, I imagine resources are going to be even more limited than they already were prior to the COVID crisis as well. But it seems to me that's kind of a big stumbling block to getting committees to think much more in depth about the impacts of gender, not just in terms of from a guidance point of view, but also having the data at hand to begin to ask the questions that are fundamentally important to getting governments to think about this in much more depth. There is kind of one final point that I wanted to end on, and I think this is important, and so if we're trying to get committees to think much more in depth about gendered scrutiny, one of the aspects which is an important part of the post-leg process in the UK is getting government departments to undertake post-leg reviews of their own, usually 3 to 5 years after an act has entered the statute books. There is again guidance on what government departments should do for that, and again from my understanding is there isn't a guidance there in terms of looking at the gendered impacts of law apart from this. Also, it's pretty gender blind in its own right as well. So again, one aspect would be to get government departments to start providing information in their memoranda to committees in the UK to provide data and information on the impacts of gender. But there is a problem with this approach, and it's been seen more frequently in the UK at the moment, and that government departments have stopped producing these reviews. And understandably, probably overwhelmed by Brexit, overwhelmed by obviously now COVID, but this was happening prior to any of these challenges becoming centre stage in terms of the policy outlook of government. And I think the key thing, if to try and get committees to focus much more on gender scrutiny, it's to make sure that if we're trying to get government to focus on this and committees, that there is oversight of that as well. And one of the issues around the lack of reviews coming from government at the moment is the fact no one's overseeing it. If no one's overseeing it, if it's going to cause government more work, they're more likely to stop doing it. And unless someone's there saying, why haven't you produced this? Why haven't you done this? Why isn't that being produced on time? And I think that's something that's important if we're trying to ensure that we change the culture of parliaments to focus much more on gender scrutiny, that there is much more oversight of it, because if it's going to cause more work for them, they will ultimately stop doing it unless someone's there to make sure that they are. I think I'll leave it there because we have run out of time.
I'm afraid we have. Thank you, Tom, very much. Excellent points and contributions as well. I'll hand it over to Franklin to close.
Yes, thank you very much. And so as we are coming to the end of this webinar, I want just to reconfirm what Shannon has said, that we will reply in writing to the questions we have received. So let me thank our excellent speakers and all of you for joining this discussion today. I also want to thank Shannon for facilitating the session, and specifically Kirti, who is helping us behind the scenes. Now, we have discussed the first two policy papers, and they are now accessible on our website. Now, one of the questions from Janet Veit was actually to continue this discussion. So I'm actually very pleased to announce that we will continue this discussion. We are having a second webinar to discuss paper 3 and 4 of this series. And this second webinar will take place on the 5th of October at 14:30 UK time. And then we will speak specifically and delve into the question of PLS of general legislation, but also specifically the question of access to data, which was, of course, and how do we rely on gender relevant data. So save the date, 5th of October at 14:30 UK time. A registration link will soon be posted as well. So looking forward seeing you then. Thank you very much.